So we're going to start this vehicle this morning, this Aveo. It's about -9 Celsius. It's sitting in the sun, so it's probably a little warmer. But it's been sitting all night. The fuel pressure on the gauge, you can't read it there because it's up against the windshield. It's dropped down to about 15 psi, which is acceptable because it's sat overnight. I want to see what it goes to when I cycle the key on. You can hear the fuel pump run through a prime. We got 52, 54 pounds pressure. So we're going to fire up the scan tool and have a look at some data. See if we can see anything abnormal in the data list. I'm not going to do a scan here. I'm just going to look at data. Temperature, barometric pressure, coolant temperature is 28 Fahrenheit. That makes sense. Intake air temperature is 24 Fahrenheit. Ambient temperature is 8 Fahrenheit. Wonder where it's getting that one from. That's interesting. MAF, let's see, barrel reading 28.9. Map 28.9. Thing looks relatively normal here. There's no fuel pressure PID, but we got the fuel pressure gauge on it. Yesterday when I went to bring this thing in, it had sat for about 5 hours and it acted like it wasn't getting fuel. So I'm gonna have a look at engine RPM and injector pulse command while I try to start it. Where is injector pulse? Hard to see out here with the glare. Fuel pump relay is off. Well, we might as well watch that. Make sure it turns it back on. A little cool out here. I did find a bulletin on rough running and hard starting with injectors needing flushing, and it acts like that. It's not in this data list. Well, it should be in field trim data. Now there's no RPM in this one. Injector pulse width milliseconds. I'll watch the tach while it's cranking. Well, it's definitely commanding it. It's like it's getting no fuel. Yet we got nearly 60 pounds of fuel pressure. Must be getting a reference because it's commanding the injector pulse width. There's no RPM on the tach though. That's odd. Usually you'd see an RPM signal on the tach, yet it's commanding injector pulse width. Let's see if we get a crank signal. There's no codes. Well, actually I haven't checked this morning for codes. So let's do that. It is possible that the tach is not responding because of its cranking. Not all tachs work during cranking. They usually do, but without knowing this for sure, let's see if we can find the cam and crank signals here. Spark advance. Well, we might as well look at spark advance. Engine load. I'll get set up here. So I've got it connected to engine data or cam actuator data. We'll watch cam signal and crank signal. Definitely got signals. it's acting like it's not getting fuel through the injectors. Well, I'm going to try something. So I pulled the fuel pump relay because I want to see how much the fuel pressure drops when I crank it. Well, it's delivering some fuel, but then it's trying to start now too. So I put the fuel pump relay back in now. It's definitely acting like the fuel injectors aren't delivering enough fuel. Let's try something else. So I notice it's nearly full of fuel. I wonder if they could have accidentally put some diesel fuel in this thing, because that's how it would act if it had poor quality fuel. So here's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try to introduce some propane into the air induction system while it's cranking to see if it'll run with propane. Let it run for a few seconds. Turned off the propane. Well, I think we better check the fuel quality in this thing. And if the fuel quality looks good, I think we're doing an injector flush. And then put it back outside and try it again. There's where I introduced the propane right in front of the mass airflow sensor into the engine. I was looking for a vacuum hose, but there wasn't one that I could conveniently take off in the cold outside. So I took a fuel sample off of the fuel pump while it was running, and it looks like gasoline. Kind of smells odd though. Of course, that could be the juice container I've got it in. I'm going to pour some on the concrete floor and see if it evaporates somewhere where it's safe in case it catches on fire. Gasoline will evaporate and leave behind basically no stain, whereas diesel fuel will leave an oily residue. So I lit it on fire and it seemed to burn quite well, but it did leave behind a stain. So I tried some known good gasoline and did exactly the same thing, and they both burned about the same amount and left behind the same stain. So I'm not sure if that gasoline is contaminated or not. It's suspicious. I'm gonna have to ask them if they just filled the tank, because it looks like it's just full, and they would have driven it about 35-40 kilometers to get here. I'm going to flush the injectors and then put it outside. So I've got the injector flusher running on it now with about 58 pounds of fuel pressure. Remove the fuel pump relay, which is this middle one here. That disables the fuel pump. Because it's a returnless system, I don't have to worry about the fuel going back via the return line. Dialed up about 58 psi. Here's the cleaner that I'm using. This is what GM recommends. I put basically 3 ounces in a half a liter. I think that's a 1 liter container. This OTC injector flusher uses shop air pressure. So we gotta let it run now until it runs out of fuel. And then we'll put it back outside, take it for a road test and put it back outside and let it cool off and see what happens. It's been running now for like 20 minutes, 25 minutes on a liter of gasoline. It's pretty economical. So this vehicle, this Aveo, has been sitting here for about 6 hours now, and it's cooled off, I think. So let's see how it starts now after flushing the injectors. Fuel pressure, not good. Well, I'm going to connect an alternate supply of fuel to this thing. That's got to be fuel related.
Well, I think I'm going to run the fuel out of the tank and replace it with some known good gas. Changed my mind. Before I'm going to dump all this gasoline out of the tank, I'm going to park it outside the shop door with this fuel pressure flusher, fuel injector flushing kit on it. And it's got clean gasoline in it. It's running on it right now. So I'm going to park it outside the door, connect the shop air pressure tomorrow morning, and of course disable the fuel pump like I have, and see how it starts.
So I've got an alternate supply of fuel connected to this, a straight fuel in this flusher. It's set at 55. Maybe I'll set it at 57 pounds. Let's see how, oh, the door's frozen. Let's see how it starts, or not. Well, that's special. Well, it's not fuel then. Well, we'll have to look at some other stuff.
So I'm back trying to start this car again this afternoon. Notice the tach is not moving. It's trying to fire. Then a tach jumped up there and it fired a couple times. Yet it's not setting any fault codes. You would think if it was missing a crank signal, it would set a fault code. So I got a Noid light installed across one of the injectors, number 4 injector. Sure, now it's going to start. It's not firing the injectors. Now, why would it not be firing the injectors? Definitely not firing the injectors the way it should be. If I can get it started, I'm going to bring it in the shop. It's got to be a crank sensor problem or something. Well, why isn't it setting a frickin' fault code? So let's see if there's any codes in it after all that extended cranking. P0627, I think that's a fuel pump relay. It says it's undocumented. Let's check in troubleshooter. Engine code tips P0627. Survey says fuel pump relay control. Well, I had the fuel pump relay out, so that makes sense. But no cam or crank codes. Let's have a look at engine data. Custom data list. Deselect everything, just pick engine speed, coolant temperature, cold start, airflow. Where's injector pulse? Spark. No, that's not what I wanted. Spark advance. Injector pulse width. Graph. So we're going to graph these data parameters while I crank it. Starts now. Definitely an RPM signal and airflow signal, and it's commanding the injector pulse on. It's acting like it's bad fuel. Damn. The other thing that bugs me about this thing is that when it does start and run, it's not flooded. So it's definitely a fuel issue. Now, is it lack of injector pulse? The injector Noid light seemed pretty erratic when I was cranking it. But now it's running, obviously, and running perfectly fine, nice and smooth, no misfires. I think I'm going to set up a 4-channel lab scope to look at injector pulse width, cam and crank signals. And I don't know what else. I looked at data on the scan tool, everything looked normal. It shouldn't have any reason not to start. Crank sensor, but I unplugged the crank sensor, I made up a jumper harness, plugged it in down below, and I've teed into the crank signal on channel 2. And the two cam signals are on channel 3 and 4, and of course channel 1 has injector waveform on cylinder number 1. So I'm going to park it outside. Now, if it doesn't start tomorrow, which I'm sure it won't, I can just simply unplug the crank sensor wire here, the purple one, and I'm sure that will disable the crank, and we'll see what happens. But I want to lab scope these waveforms when it's cold, because it's obviously running perfect right now. So obviously there's no tack, but it runs off the cam sensors, but it cranks longer than normal. It starts pretty damn good without the crank signal. Now I'm curious if there's a fault code. There better damn well be a fault code for that missing crank signal. So I'm going to check it for current codes now. Oh yeah, now we have a crank signal. P0335, that's the crank signal code. Obviously it's missing completely and it runs perfectly fine without it. But I wonder if it's producing some kind of a signal when it's cold. I'm going to stick it outside now and try starting it without a crank signal at all. Theoretically it should run fine. As you can see, it runs fine now. So we're back working on this Aveo for this hard start cold. I want to look at engine data one more time in case I missed something in the last few times I've looked at this custom data list. So deselect everything. Engine speed, coolant temperature, cold startup, ambient air temperature, intake temperature, airflow, barrel, map. Oxygen sensors really don't matter. Injector pulse width. Engine runtime. List view. So I'm going to graph this engine RPM and injector pulse width. Where is injector pulse width? Right there. Now I'm also going to go into the lab scope. I've got the lab scope set up under the hood, plugged in with a USB cable. That should be recording data in the background. So I got on channel 1 here, I've got injector waveform. Channel 2 is the crank sensor. Channel 3 and 4 are both cam sensors. So we're going to crank it and see what happens. Got a beautiful crank signal. There's no reason why it's not starting. Fuel pressure is good. Okay, let's pause this and replay it. Zoom it in. Or zoom out, sorry. Snap-on scan tools won't let you zoom in. So we're graphing one injector. So every Let's see, that's 1 engine revolution. That's 2 engine revolutions, so that's number 1 injector firing. You can see it's firing, it's commanding it. We got a crank signal, we got 2 cam signals, we got injector, but it's like we're not getting an injector, we're not getting fuel delivery out of the tips of the injectors. I flushed the injectors, I've ran an alternate fuel supply on it. I'm going to push this thing in the shop just as it sits right now. So here's the recording of engine data that I took. Injector pulse width is there. RPM is there. Coolant temperature is 39 Fahrenheit. Air temperature is 35 Fahrenheit. Air pressure looks good. It's got to be a fuel problem. Either the injectors are not delivering fuel. That's the only thing it can be. We're going to do an injector flow test. So we're going to try an injector flow test on number 4 right now. Got the injector hooked up with the jumper to this test box. When I press this button, it's going to fire the injector and the pressure should drop. So it went from 55 down to 30. Definitely dropping. So using the bidirectional commands to command the fuel pump relay on. Now we're on injector number 3. It's definitely delivering fuel. Okay, we'll try number 4. On the fuel pump again. This is number 2. Definitely delivering fuel. Fuel pump relay. Key on, engine off. And this is injector number 1. Okay, so why doesn't this thing run? It's got to be the fuel quality. I bet you it starts now. I think I should develop a fuel leak outside and start this car on fire. That might be the answer to fix this thing. So after reconnecting the injectors and turning the car on, it starts basically like there's nothing wrong with it. Well, I pretty much, I think, confirmed that the injectors are delivering fuel. The crank and cam signals are all there. The only thing it can be is fuel quality. Yet I ran it on an alternate supply of fuel, but possibly there was still leftover fuel in the rail. I mean, it does take a while for it to run through a liter of gasoline. The fuel rail would hold a volume of gasoline, so I'm going to put a battery charger on this thing and I'm going to pump the tank empty and replace the gas in the tank. That's the only thing I can think of. So here's what I've connected. I've got a fuel line running into a gas can here, and I'm using the onboard fuel pump. Pump the gas out of the tank. It's going to take a little while, but I got lots of wires to remove while it's doing that. I got a battery charger on it, so the battery doesn't go flat. I bypassed the fuel pump relay with a fuel pump jumper, so that's why the fuel pump is running with the key off. And we're going to pump all the gasoline out of this thing and fill it up with clean, known good gas and take it for a road test and see how it runs. So I pumped all of the fuel out of the tank, was approximately 7 to 8 gallons, and refilled the tank with good, known good fuel, approximately 35 liters, something like that, 30 to 35 liters. This thing's only got 82,000 kilometers, which is like 50,000 miles on it. It should not have needed spark plugs in that low mileage. So we'll see how it starts tomorrow morning in the cold, although it's not supposed to be too cold tomorrow. It's supposed to be near freezing. But it was acting up today and it was above freezing. So we'll see what happens with the alternate known good fuel in the tank now. Here's hoping.
So here we go, trying to start this vehicle again. This morning it's 32 Fahrenheit, 0 Celsius. Turn the heater fan off. Oh, look at that. So Maybe it was the fuel after all. Let's try shutting it off and starting it one more time.